great pleasure to have you here today, Brian. So he is actually going to introduce himself, and so I'm not going to take a lot of the time to do that. But I will briefly say that Brian is a principal program manager at Microsoft, and he's been working in the Cosine and Windows group, and I think he'll probably talk about that. And I've been doing some research with Brian for quite a few years, and he has the most amazing insights and the amazing skill with research methods that I've seen. It's been such a pleasure. And one of the reasons I invited you, Brian, is that about half of the class are fourth-year students, and many of them want to be developers. And I think some, they admitted that they were just taking this class because they needed another class to graduate. And so your job is to convince them that this was a good thing, taking this class, that they're learning some of these skills that would also help in their developer career. So I will pass it over to you and let you share, because I think you have some slides to share with us.
You have some slides. Thank you, everyone, for letting me come and talk to you today. Can you see my slides?
We can.
Perfect. So as Peggy mentioned, my name is Brian. We're constantly changing the names of our teams and our organizations. I currently work in what is called the Azure Edge and Platform team. We'll talk about a little bit in more detail what that actually means. Just a little bit of introduction. My background actually was an economics major for my undergrad, and then I went and got a master's in software engineering. I've been at Microsoft for 14 years now, and I actually spent my first 8 years as a software developer, and then for the last 6 years, I've been a program manager. I've been on lots of different teams doing lots of different things. I think it's one of the values of working at a place like Microsoft, where 1,000 different companies in one. I've done everything from sort of channel level cryptographic security to working on Windows user experiences. And so that has, I think, enriched my overall perspectives on software development. And as Peggy mentioned, I'm currently the program manager lead for our developer productivity team within my organization, Azure Edge and Platform. We build sort of the foundational pieces for the various platforms Microsoft makes. So we work on the Windows kernel, we work on the Azure host OS image, things of that nature. And so on my team specifically, we build developer tools for our internal developers to keep them productive and happy. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about why it is relevant for me to come and talk to you all today. Talk a little bit about, from my perspective, why it is that we do code reviews, the value that I see out of them, and what are some of the biggest challenges we have in our code review processes and tools today that we're hoping to solve when we actually see them in practice. And so I wear a lot of different hats in my day-to-day job. On one hand, I work on an engineering team that writes a lot of code, and we have to review that code. And so we just do normal engineering practices. But I also work on the team that owns the code review policy for our organization. And so we actually dictate things. You heard Chris mention in Bing that code reviews have to be done within 24 hours. For my org, which is all of Windows and Azure platform development, we set what are those policies that we have to adhere to in order to complete pull requests. And then the last hat I will talk about is my team is actually building a new code review tool to replace CodeFlow. And so we talked about CodeFlow a lot, and there are it was groundbreaking. It is actually a great tool for lots of reasons, but it has some limitations today. And so my team is looking at how we can address some of those limitations with a more modern tool. And so starting with why do we do code reviews? A lot of the people who have already spoken today, you talk about the obvious things, quality. And code reviews are just one way to address quality. You talked about automated code reviews like we do. My team also owns a bunch of static analysis tools in order to try to limit the number of things you need to catch with code review. But I think of those as very complementary type activities. It's all trying to do what I call shift left, take issues that might otherwise be discovered by our customers and shift them left into the development loop itself, which allows you to not burden your customers with those issues, but also allows them to be addressed sort of more efficiently. But for me, code reviews are also a security feature. And so we spend a lot of time and effort in Windows trying to harden our internal engineering systems. We do network isolation, we do strong cryptographic trust relationships between all of our systems. And we've gotten to the point where it's actually a lot easier to compromise a human than it is to compromise our most hardened systems. And so code reviews protect against people intentionally introducing malicious code into our code base. And that's like an important and explicit part of our code review sort of culture. But they're also used by some of our threat intelligence teams, our red teams and our blue teams, in order to help identify and eliminate specific security vulnerabilities. But for me, the most important aspect of code reviews is its community building. As Chris has found in his own research, like code review participation helps in community building. It helps influence future collaborations. We have seen internally at Microsoft that people who participate in code reviews feel more a vibrant part of their engineering community. We see that they are also view their peers more favorably. And they are more likely to stay at Microsoft. And so there is a lot of positive sort of cultural attributes of code review participation that I think are, like, for me, the main benefit. And there's a sort of a journey in my mind, and this was touched on as one of the very last questions that Chris got answered, but there's this journey of code review participation, I think, as you move on to a new team, a new project, a new technology stack. And early on, I think code review participation is really about learning about the team. And especially on teams that are rapidly growing, you may have a lot of people who are in this phase. I actually just went and looked at the numbers about an hour ago. 20% of the developers in my org have joined within the last 6 months, have joined Microsoft within the last 6 months. And so these are people who are like, we have a lot of people who are very new to the code base, and it is a great opportunity to just observe. And once you get a little more familiar, like once you have onboarded more effectively, then you get to the point where you can contribute. You can say, hey, like here's a defect that was not found that I can help you address, and you're able to give back to the team. But for me, like where things really get interesting is when you can sort of move to what I think of as the last phase, where you can step back and look at more systemic issues across the team. We aren't looking at what is the defect in this code review, but what are the common themes that I am seeing across the team, and providing greater sort of like senior level mentorship across the team on how do we address some of the broader themes and design patterns we're seeing. And I think we need to have code review processes and tools that acknowledge and address all of these things. And the only way we can do that is if we build a great understanding of the people who are using these tools in their day-to-day lives and what are the challenges that they are facing, which is a research question. So I spend a lot of my time going and interviewing the developers who use my tools, they are my customers, interviewing them, analyzing the telemetry, surveying them, and then triangulating all of these sources together to try to weave a narrative about what is actually going on. And so I want to talk about some of the key challenges that I'm trying to address, with my customers today, and that I'm trying to address on my own team. And one that's important to call out is, like, at Microsoft, we work across a lot of platforms. In my org, we work across at least 3 different platforms, and developers flow between them. And so for something like CodeFlow, it may be a great solution for one of the platforms, but not for all of the platforms that our internal developers use. And so there are some web tools that we use that don't necessarily have the best user experiences. And so looking at how can we have better multi-platform support in our tools. And where some of our internal projects are really unique across software development is just the scale. The Windows code base, as an example, it's a single repository that has hundreds of thousands of code files that is churning very, very frequently. I went and looked, and there were 400 code reviews completed today. in that Windows source tree. And so like that code is being touched very frequently. And that makes finding owners really hard because a lot of these files hadn't been touched in many years, if not a decade or more. And so finding like who owns certain code files is a really tough challenge to solve, particularly because we see that our organizations are so big and they are constantly churning. And so again, the Windows source tree is regularly touched by thousands of developers spanning hundreds of teams. And so that makes finding, like I said, not only owners, but just domain experts in general very difficult. If I am working on a UI feature and I need to understand how that is interacting with something deep in the kernel stack, well, those teams are organizationally really distinct. And so finding those domain experts can be very difficult. And we're using a lot of different technologies. And so in the platform group, we are using over 140 different programming languages. And our developers are often switching between them. And so where this becomes a more tangible problem is, I may be working in a more procedural programming language, and then someone asks me to review something in a more object-oriented language. And so like, how can I do an effective code review if I have to do such like a major fundamental shift in like the way I'm thinking about that code? And that's a problem that our developers are facing every day. And a lot of that all contributes to this fact that it often takes a long time to get your code review completed. And so if the median code review, sure, like maybe that gets done within a day, a work day, and that's okay. But just to get out to the P80, you're looking at almost a work week in order to get your code review completed. And so at that point in time, a developer may either be completely blocked, in which case like we have lost a ton of productive capacity from them, or they might have moved on. And so they're having to constantly do context switching back and forth between the project that they were hoping to finish and their new project. And so it's, as Chris had previously mentioned, there's lots of things that contribute to this, but just like even lag in when I ask for a code review and when I actually get someone to start the process, like that's the biggest gap in all of this. And how do we close that down with the right incentives and policies is something we're looking at. And so some of the things that my team is planning to do is we are looking at investing in our own code review solution, and is like, how do we collaborate with the other engineering teams? Like it's one thing to say that sort of kernel Windows and base Azure platform development, we use a tool, but the Office team uses something else, which is different than what the Xbox team uses. And so it's how do we coordinate with other engineering teams that will allow us to get some economies of scale with that investment. And the way we do that is making sure that, okay, how do we get everyone excited about this cross-platform tool that will solve a lot of the broader issues that existing tools don't solve today? Because like, a big problem is with existing development tools, not just code review tools, but even IDEs, is they're designed for the retail environment, and there are almost no other software engineering projects in the world quite like some of ours because of those scale issues that I'd mentioned. You have Google, and that's sort of it. And so it's how do we make sure that we can get enough investment resources built up that we can make a compelling tool. And one of the things I'm very passionate about is how do we integrate our tools better with the existing developer workflows. So oftentimes internally at Microsoft, we have these standalone tools that serve a single function. And so you're constantly context switching between these things. And that's bad because often you have to manually carry that context between the tools. And it's also bad just because they have very different user experiences. And so from a pure usability standpoint, it creates disruption in the user workflow. And if you have the code review experience better integrated in your code editing experience, like one huge benefit of that is I can address the comments sooner. Like I don't have to go and look at what the comment was in a standalone tool and then sort of copy and paste that back into my code editor, I can just address it in line. And that saves time, it saves clicks. Another thing that Chris had touched on in his dream of like what an ID or what a code review tool could be, and I should note that a lot of these ideas came about because I asked Chris what we should be thinking about as we look at a new code review tool, is how do we provide more contextually relevant information? And so he had mentioned find all references, and so we are looking at how we can have actual like true find all references, not just string search, but we will use our CI/CD builds to actually look at the true linking between the code. But also things like IntelliSense. If you are working on a massive code base that you may only have limited understanding of because it's too big for anyone to have full understanding of, how can you have things that you are used to in your code editing experience, like rich IntelliSense, be part of your code review experience so that you can actually understand what it is you're trying to review better. And I really, something else that Chris had mentioned, I really want to remove this notion of all or nothing, where it's today, if I'm signing off on a code review, I sign off on the entire thing, every part of every file that has been touched. Can we really say that certain parts need review more than others, and that because of my particular expertise, I maybe would be better suited to reviewing just, one subset of that entire review, code review. And so that's one of the things we are looking at. And all of this is in addition to, more structural changes in our code base itself, our organization structures, in order to make it so that we aren't having to try to manage and review and understand such a large scale code base in a way that just like isn't actually sort of pageable into any human's memory. And so that was sort of like what I had to share, just to set a little bit of scene. And then I'm happy to take questions. Hopefully people found that interesting.
Thank you, Brian. That was super interesting. I found it fascinating, actually. I knew that you were looking at a new code review tool, but I didn't really understand why or get, sort of the implications of that. And you explained it really, really well. So very ambitious project, right? Going forward to do that. So yeah, Neil, did you want to ask Brian the question that you posted in the chat?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. That was really interesting. And just reviewing academic papers, and a lot of those points actually were quite, resonated with me, this idea of like getting experts to chime in on little pieces or how long it takes to do these reviews. We have similar problems. My question is about some of the automation that people are exploring with code review and other types of software engineering. But we know that, for example, women get evaluated more harshly in code review in other areas. And if we're going to use automation based on data sets of existing code reviews, shouldn't we be a bit worried that some of those biases are going to come back when we use the automation to help us with the code reviews?
Yes, absolutely. To be clear, we find that we have bias in just about every single aspect of our software engineering practices. It is very real. It is something that we should pay very particular attention to. We should acknowledge that we have those biases, and we should look at what are the safeguards we need to put in place to limit them as much as we can. And it's interesting, this notion of I could imagine a world where we actually see these biases along with lots of different factors. It is both who is able to participate in the code reviews themselves, who are being asked as the experts, and how harshly are people being judged. And one of the things that I am interested in as I look at a new code review tool is, can we be better at detecting what are valuable code review comments to begin with? Can we detect stylistic comments that result in stylistic changes versus actual compiled syntactical changes? And can we generate some reports based on that? And one of the things that we are learning about all of our diversity and inclusion conversations is you can't address it if you don't shine a light on it. And so just being able to quantify the problem is useful, because then you can get executives in the org talking about it. And if it's not top of mind, then we can't really address our own unconscious biases. And so I think step one is just like, can we actually get better optics to understand the problem and make those data slices? Like that's a sort of internal research question that I think is incredibly important. And I think the other thing is teams do need to be aware of sort of equal participation in code reviews. Chris had mentioned that oftentimes teams view it as a little bit of a tax, but we do see that like there are increasing number of teams that view it as a healthy part of team activities, and they actively want to participate in them, and people are rewarded for them. We do see that people who participate in code reviews, there's a bit of a positive relationship to sort of some career trajectory stuff there. And so I think another thing is just being cognizant of who is being asked to share their expertise, because just asking someone also sort of sets up everyone's mental model of who the experts truly are. And so I think these things need to be addressed head on, but you need to just track and talk about them very openly is, I guess, how I would think about that, if that's helpful.
Yeah, very helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Neil's actually a professor in our department. I don't know if you've met each other, but
we have not. It's nice to meet you, Neil.
Likewise.
But yes, like I had sort of said earlier, it is, the biases we see around code reviews are the same ones we see for promotions to management positions, and getting as we move to a sort of future with more remote work, more hybrid work, are we going to see that is going to introduce new sets of biases where do we see that certain groups of people are more likely to be physically in the office? And if you are physically in the office, are you more likely to get the juicy projects because your manager happens to see you there, and without even thinking about it, it's just like, oh, can you go and do this really valuable, high impact thing that just came on the team's radar? And so it is something that I think we need to be very aware of moving forward.
And yeah, I'll just see if anybody else wants to ask a question, but let me jump in if that's okay. So I know that you've been looking a lot at developer, I guess, productivity metrics or performance, maybe system performance data, right? Since work from home during the pandemic, have you seen any shift in code reviews, the number of code reviews that have been done or when they're done? Or
Great question. So it's
I actually don't know the answer.
Oh, great. All right.
Well, not
I
totally.
thought you were lobbing it up for me. So I will say that my fear when we started this shift to remote work was that some of these more collaborative activities like code review were going to suffer. And that has not been the case. We have seen that code review participation has gone up, and we have seen that the amount of time it takes to complete code reviews has gone down, which are both things that we want to see. And so I think some of that is people, as we shift to remote work, are clearly hungry for any sort of social interaction with their team, actually any interaction at all with their team. And there's also an increased need to better understand what your team is working on, because you're not just casually talking to them in the hallways. And I think code review is a method that people are using in order to meet that need.
Great. Thanks, Brian. Okay, any questions?
I had a question.
Yeah, jump in. Thanks, Matt.
So you touched on sort of different reasons that we do code reviews, or that you do code reviews at Microsoft. One being community, which makes a lot of sense, but the other one was security, specifically protecting against deliberate vulnerabilities. Those two things kind of sound in conflict with each other. How do you run a code review where you're trying to determine whether or not someone is deliberately producing vulnerabilities, but at the same time develop trust, right?
Yeah, that's it's a great question. I will say that people trying to purposefully introduce vulnerabilities into our source code is a very, 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 very rare thing, right? If ever, is probably what my legal team would want me to say. And so, but so it really is not we do not ever talk about it, right, through the lens of, hey, what you should be looking at is making sure that someone isn't clearly introducing a security vulnerability. It is, hey, but it is, we don't want anyone to be able to just check anything into the Windows code base as an example, because it runs on 1 billion devices. And so it really is about accountability, and that people need to be accountable for what it is that they are checking in. And you need someone to sort of sign off on that. But that's not a great way to answer the question as I'm listening to myself talk, but it is like, we view it much more from the community angle, but we acknowledge that one of the benefits, one of the sort of tangential benefits, is that all code has to go through another set of humans' eyes. So like, no one can obviously do something malicious.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Great, thanks. Great question, Matt. We just have a couple of minutes left. Any other questions?
I have a question.
Great. Jump in, Suresh.
Since you're working on another code review tool that's specifically for, if I'm not wrong, Azure and Windows. So does this mean like we need different code review tools for different categories of software applications? Or what I'm trying to say is, what were these features that couldn't be built in the previous code review tool that Chris was talking about? Why do we have to have like different code review tools?
Yeah, well, there are, it's a great question. And it's, I think there's a couple of aspects there. One is that some of our software projects truly are unique in the industry, like just because of their scale and their age. Like there is nothing else quite like Windows. Even Linux is not, nearly the size of the Windows source tree. And it churns a lot more. Like it is in many places a lot more modern than Windows. And so there's just like, there is a unmet need because it's so unique. But I think sort of more broadly than that is, as the whole ecosystem of developer tools is evolving, then that opens up new opportunities. And so like, it might not have ever made sense before to integrate the code review experience as tightly into the IDE as we're looking at doing it now, because there weren't actually any benefits. But as we can do better sort of offline intelligence building from our CI/CD builds, because we now have the cloud infrastructure that allows us to do it, then that allows us to provide IntelliSense. And if we can provide IntelliSense, then we should do it in a similar way that it's done within the IDE. And that like wouldn't have been possible even a few years ago for a project like ours, just because the scale required to do that sort of thing. And so it's evolving with the tools and the ecosystem around us. Drives new changes.
So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Suresh. We have time for one more, and then we probably should move to the activity. Jordan, did you want to jump in with your question?
Sure. Yeah. I said going back to collaboration and interaction within teams, do you find challenges with finding solutions that keep in mind cultural differences? And I give an example as communication preferences and styles.
Yeah, it's a great question that, to be honest, like code review, we have so many places where we need to fix handling different communication styles that code review is pretty far down the list, and we just haven't got into it yet. But it's like some people like giving and receiving very direct and blunt feedback, and some people don't, as an example. And so I think that in all things like this, it is important to be clear, be explicit about what the cultural principles of the team are. And that should include all communication and not just code review. And so like, what are the healthy and expected ways to communicate with your colleagues? And even things like setting expectations on how long it will take for a code review to get completed. Because as we, in a remote world, will have a greater span across time zones and sort of core working hours. I think having team-wide norms on how to have healthy communication is the only way to solve some of these things. I don't know that I necessarily see it being mandated or placed in the tools themselves. I think this is a sort of standalone cultural problem that teams have to address.
Thank you. Yeah.
So with that, I do have one more question for you. So I've seen you use a lot. So we've talked a lot about research methods in this course throughout the last few weeks. And I have seen you use a lot of, data mining and data analysis methods. I've seen you use survey. You were involved with the diary study, and you also interview developers. And I guess in a way you do observations because you're on a team, right? Mm-hmm. So I was just wondering, which of those methods do you find the most valuable in terms of sort of bang for the buck?
Without a doubt, like no question in my mind, one-on-one interviews are like the most valuable research method that I use. Like I do lots of telemetry. I shared a bunch of stats that all came from telemetry. It's really easy to get a lot of telemetry. It's really, it is relatively easy to run a very broad survey. But none of that data lets me understand the why something happens. And like, it doesn't allow me to understand the context of it. And you cannot get that unless you go and talk to people. Yeah. And so I think when I look at what are, my job as a program manager at Microsoft is to be sort of the advocate for my customers who happen to be internal engineers for me. But it's like, I am the customer advocate, and I have to understand what are the opportunities and what are the pain that they are going through. And you cannot do that if you do not go and talk to them.
Mm-hmm. And even though, with interviews, it's hard to scale them up. Do you have any trouble convincing, leadership that even, that maybe you talk to 10 or whatever, do they buy it, or do they prefer to see, telemetry data, for example?
It's a great question. And it's why, while I think that interviews are the most valuable, you cannot do any one technique in isolation. Like, I am a very firm believer in mixed methods. And so what I often do is, like, when I'm presenting up to leadership to try to get them to, fund whatever it is that I am trying to go and build, is I will often show on a slide, I will have some data, I'll have a chart that shows like what is the objective truth, and then I will have customer quotes to put that into context. And I find that is that really is a winning combination for getting management to buy off on things, because I don't have to go and have enough I don't have to interview, X% of the org. I have to go and interview enough so that I can understand the context with what we're seeing in the data. And so as long as I can understand, I can get an explanation for why I'm seeing what I'm seeing in the data, then that works great.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. And thank you for joining our class today. It's been a great pleasure to have you here.